I am becoming really concerned about the shape and the development of the welfare state, and how really food banks are becoming a legitimised and normalised part of the welfare state structure. And that's worrying for a number of reasons, mainly because it's the fact that people, instead of having a secure and a minimum income to buy the things or to purchase the things that they might need, they have to turn increasingly to charitable forms of support. And I read an article this week that I've already talked to the panelists about, and a quote really stuck out for me from previous British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister at the time when our welfare state was first developed, and when those abhorrent poor laws were abolished. And he said, "The evil of charity is that it tends to make the charitable think that he has done his duty by giving away some trifling sum. His conscience is put to sleep, and he takes no trouble to consider the social problems any further." And now that might seem quite harsh from Clement Attlee, but there indeed is some truth in it. And particularly around food aid, I think there is further stigmatism around the actual contribution of food rather than the contribution of, for example, cash transfers or money. You know, people feel better giving, we're seeing this narrative where people feel more comfortable giving food to a food bank, or ensuring people have food bank vouchers or vouchers for goods and services, because they feel that they can't trust people who are living in poverty to spend their money on really the things that they ought to be spending their money on, and that's basic necessities. And you know, we've seen that really disturbing narrative appear under tweets or videos of, for example, Julianne Maney last week, the paediatrician in Northern Ireland, who talked so passionately about the impact of poverty in Northern Ireland. And we see that blame culture of members of the public feeling like it's the responsibility of the parents, that it's the responsibility of families, and not the responsibility of the state to really take a root and branch approach to looking at the root causes of poverty. And yeah, that brings me on to the use of food banks during the pandemic. We have seen a real normalisation of food banks during the pandemic, and we've seen the distribution of food aid as being really the first go-to for people who are in need, and there's something that's terribly wrong about that. I also see the Marcus Rashford campaign that has achieved so much in bringing much needed attention to the issue of poverty. But again, he's focused very much on food poverty, and we've seen that rather than, again, the government stepping in, we do see that there's been a massive U-turn there at the weekend, but rather than the government stepping in, we've seen charitable organisations and businesses trying to step up to the mark to provide, for example, free lunches and food parcels to support children who are in need. But that is only solving one of the many problems associated with poverty. And actually, I'd argue that it's not solving it at all. It really is just a means to an end, or a sticking plaster approach. As well as that, it's important to note that this normalisation has led to the government funding food bank provision or food aid. We see that the executive in their latest COVID relief package have attributed £6.5 million to emergency community support and food aid. We also see that the UK government has provided 16 million in the provision of food aid. The question that I ask is, why is this money going to food aid provision rather than to strengthening our social security system and ensuring that people have a minimum income and the dignity of having enough money to buy the basic necessities, and not facing poverty, or indeed increasingly facing destitution? So I'm going to leave it there. And yeah, I'm just really, really pleased to have so many people as part of the debate today, to think about whether or not we really want food aid to be part of our welfare state, and whether it's an institution that we want to continue to bolster. As I say, I am really conflicted about this, as I am a community volunteer. I volunteer for my local conference of St Vincent de Paul, and every day I am referring people to food banks, and I am referring people to have food parcels delivered to their homes. And that's mostly because we are struggling at the moment as a charitable organisation as well, and are relying so heavily on the kindness of members of the public in order to ensure that we can at least give people a meal. So anyway, I'll stop my rambling. Thank you very much for indulging me, and I'm going to move on to our first speaker, who is Louise Ferguson. And Louise Ferguson is the manager of an independent food bank in Northern Ireland, the Larder in East Belfast. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much, Kyra, and thank you for what you said. So you've lined up what I would like to talk about very nicely indeed. It's good to be here with you all. Yeah, I am indeed the manager of the Larder Food Bank, and the Larder Food Bank is unique in that it sits in East Belfast and is in a church building. But not only is it in a church building, there is a Christian community that gathers there on a Sunday morning as well. So the food is moved to the sides, and it is fully utilised for both worship and food distribution. When we think about people who use food banks, often the language is around words like vulnerable, without resources, incapable, struggling, pitiable, desperate, needy, and those are the good ones. The worst ones were maybe things like lazy or scroungers. And they are such, I think, disempowering words. When we think about those who maybe volunteer or work in food banks, or who donate to food banks, the language is slightly different. And we hear words about generosity and community-minded and resourceful and compassionate, thoughtful people. And oh my goodness, which one would you like to be? And I think we live in a society, and we're part of a society, and we live in a society that admires independence and being self-made, people who stand on their own 2 feet, people who never have to, I'm sorry, that's my 6-month-old dog in the background, I apologize. People who never have to resort to using social services or social security system. And you hear it all the time, don't you, on the news, when people talk to somebody in need, and they said, I have never asked for anything of it, never had to have a handout, never had to do, and there's a certain sense of pride about that. And yet, one thing that we are created for as human beings is that we're created to thrive in community and with connection. And I'll give you COVID isolation, anyone? Do you know, was it the fact that you couldn't go to the shops that drove you mad during isolation or lockdown? Or was it the lack of connection with people, the interaction, the everyday interactions, the conversations, the ability to share good and bad news and all of that? And so connection for human beings is about interdependence. It's about being able to depend on one another, to support one another, and to respect and give dignity to one another. And that's the problem with charity and therefore food banks, because that divides our community. It divides society. So the giver is seen as generous and successful, and the receiver is the needy food. And that's where the problem lies. So it creates a power imbalance. And societies don't work when you have a power imbalance. The receiver is kept in their place of vulnerability and shame, while the giver is lauded for having the moral authority and being superior in all aspects of life. And an example of that is during COVID, when we were doing a lot of deliveries out and helping people with food parcels, I was inundated with volunteers from people who were maybe on furlough, and the desire that they had to feel useful and important and to give something back. And they were, you know, as I say, we were inundated because it's in us to want to contribute to society. It's in us to want to be part of it. It's in us to want to be needed and useful. And don't get me wrong, the Larder is incredibly grateful for the support it gets and every single donation that comes through our doors. So please don't be stopping that. But I also lead a church community, and feeding the hungry is the stock and trade of the church. It is better than to give than to receive is from the Bible. And there's a reason it says that, because when you are the giver, you hold the power. You can dictate where and how the money is spent and where your groceries go. You can expect to be thanked and acknowledged for what you do. You also have the right and the ability to withhold support when you disagree with what's happening. And you also, there is a sense that you can have feel that you have the right to make judgments on how other people spend their money, spend their time, run their lives, do all of that. The receiver, on the other hand, in these situations, loses the ability to choose. So you get handed a food parcel, your limited choice. You don't get to go to Marks and Spencer's and decide between, I don't know, a tiramisu or ice cream or whatever this week. You lose choice. You don't get to choose on activities that you do outside. You don't get to choose what you spend your money on. In fact, the only choices you get is whether you heat your home, or whether you feed yourself, or whether, I don't know, any of those options. You lose agency because no one listens to you anymore. You can be ignored. You lose self-respect, and you stop being an active participant in the community around you. So you stop being able to go into the shops and buying things and being involved in those everyday interactions with people. You stop, and maybe you haven't been, but you don't get the opportunity to be involved in your children's schooling and joining the PTA, and because you are exhausted and overwhelmed all the time just trying to make ends meet. So those everyday interactions just aren't available to you. You end up being outside of society and outside of what's going on. And at this point in our history, we unfortunately need food banks for all sorts of reasons. So we continue to need charitable support. But the one thing I would like to change, I would like us to start thinking differently about what we do when we are giving our charity, when we are donating our food, when we are donating our time. If all we're doing is doing it to make ourselves feel better, okay, and feel less guilty, it's gratefully received as it is, there needs to be a drive for us to start challenging and examining, first of all, our own attitudes towards those people who are in need of help, and also the systems and the policies and the government decisions that are being made that are creating this environment. Because a divided society is a really unhappy one and a really broken one. And that is what food banks and charity and all of those things and poverty does to a society. It divides, and it leads to unhappiness for everybody. So there's no happiness, there's no joy, there's no good society until it's good and joyful and hopeful and exciting and embracing of all, my thing. But thank you for listening. Thank you for having me, Kyra. It was a pleasure.
Louise, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. It was a really clear and compelling argument for why we need to think differently. So thanks a million. I'm going to move on now to Paul. Paul is the Northern Ireland manager of the Trussell Trust. I hope I've got that right, Paul. And really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Louise, or thanks, Kyra, and thanks, Louise. So yes, I'm the manager for the Trussell Trust here in Northern Ireland. And just to kind of clarify, we're an anti-poverty strategy, or an anti-poverty charity that supports a network of food banks across the UK. And in Northern Ireland, that is 22 food banks. They're all run by independent charities, and they've signed up to operate within the Trussell Trust model. So our vision in the Trussell Trust is for a UK without the need for food banks, or in my case in Northern Ireland, without the need for food banks. And over the past year, and more particularly over the last 8 months, I've overseen the network and supported our food banks to coordinate various projects, partnerships, and representing the Trussell Trust in public affairs matters in Northern Ireland. And I suppose I can give you a quick overview of what the last 8 months has been like. It's definitely been, I joined the Trussell Trust in December last year. It's been a baptism of fire, I'll tell you that. But yeah, I suppose the headline figure today is that we have launched revealed our mid-year stats, and that's at a UK level and also in Northern Ireland. And since between March and September, or April and September this year, our food banks provided over 32,000 emergency food parcels to people struggling to afford the basics. And of that, almost 12,000 of these parcels went to children. And that's kind of, for me, that hits home. I have two kids, and as a dad, I would do anything for them. I literally would, do absolutely anything for my two children. They mean the world to me. And these figures, 32,000 and 12,000, I feel sometimes they depersonalize the problem here. Each and every one of those figures is a person that has struggled and has taken the step to ask for help from a food bank. Our food banks operate by referral. So, there's been a process where that person has had to explain their problem and had to receive a voucher or a referral to a food bank, and then to receive emergency food. And as a dad, it's in my nature that I want to make sure I can do the best for my children. And parents out there, and Louise has hit the nail on the head, they're no different from you or I. They're exactly the same as you and I. It's just that they've been dealt circumstances that have led them to where they are today. And if you take that 32,000, those parcels, if you take that time period, it's about 180 days. And I'm rubbish at maths, but that's about 170 parcels to people a day in Northern Ireland. And that's only our 22 food banks. That's not Louise's food bank. That's not Storehouse in the city centre. It's not all the independent food banks that are not part of our network. It's also not a lot of pop-up and food aid services that have sprung up over COVID, or the existing services that exist around Northern Ireland. And also our food banks generally don't operate on weekends. So it's more than 170 if you take Saturdays and Sundays out of the way. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of the problem here in Northern Ireland. I suppose over the last 8 months, the moment I realized that coronavirus was serious, and I suppose you would heard about how serious it was from the very beginning, but it was the 20th of March. It was about 11 o'clock, and I was in a meeting with the DFC in Causeway Exchange, and I've never, ever, ever seen money be made available like money was made available on that day. That's when I remember afterwards, I phoned my wife, Jane, and I went, Jane, this is actually really serious. And she's like, why do you think that? And I was like, because the DFC have money, and they've got money to spend, and they're going to spend it, and they're going to spend it big. And I 12 years working with the DFC in housing, and always we've had no money available for this, no money available for that. So that kind of was the moment where I went, oh dear. Then almost overnight, our food banks, and some of them are on this call, had to adapt to lockdown, and Louise, you'll be the same as well. And you know what? They did a fabulous job, given the fact that, things just changed overnight. Many of the food banks are run entirely by volunteers. There's no staff, there's no paid staff. They're run by volunteers. The managers are volunteer, and they're people either from the church or from the local community that give up their own time to run this food bank. And some of those volunteers had the shield when people were basically told that they had to stay at home to protect themselves from contracting the virus. So food banks had to recruit and train new volunteers. And I have examples of one of our food bank managers. He had to stay at home, and his next door neighbour was a youth worker who always all of a sudden had less work, and he trained him over the fence. I mean, the dedication and kind of just getting around all these challenges is unbelievable. So we had to get new volunteers in. Our food banks as well, they operate food bank centres, and we have over 40 of those across Northern Ireland. And when people are referred to a food bank in normal times, they'll come along, they'll be welcomed, they'll get a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, they'll speak to the volunteers, and they'll be asked what are their specific needs. Do they need certain types of food? Do they have allergies or any particular dietary requirements? And we'll try and treat them with dignity and respect, basically, that they deserve. That had to stop overnight, obviously, with social distancing. So food banks had to develop delivery models. They had to develop ways of giving food to people in a socially distanced way. One of our food banks in southwest Belfast developed this hatch where you could give people food. And whilst it's not the most ideal, and the food banks really did struggle with that. And Louise, you talked about, it's about connection and communication. And our food banks really miss that. They miss being able to just connect on a personal level with those people. We had to adapt to that overnight. That was a massive challenge. Again, they rose to that challenge and they've come out the other side. And then moving forward, other challenges, food donations. Food is generally donated to our food banks either through churches, where there'll be a collection point, through supermarkets, where there'll be a collection point. If you go to Tesco, you see at the top of the escalator, there's a box where you can drop off your food, and I would encourage you to keep doing that. There's community organisations and businesses that will also collect food for our food banks. Obviously, that changed overnight. I mean, do you remember what Tesco and Sainsbury's was like in March and April? You had the queue outside, and there was one-way systems and all sorts of things. And actually, the collection points were removed in those cases. So our food banks were kind of panicking at that point. How are we going to get food? How are we going to keep going? How are we going to operate? And we don't want to take support from the government. That's our position. The government should be spending money on addressing the causes, not funding food banks. So we did have a panic, but thankfully businesses stepped up. We were, Tesco were very generous, and the public stepped up as well. And the public made financial donations to their food banks, and they were able to go to wholesalers and buy specific food items that they needed. But we got through, and that's a credit to the local community, to businesses, and the people who really did support our food banks. So those are kind of some of the challenges, some of the positives. And to be honest with you, there's not many positives about food banks. I mean, they shouldn't have to exist here, but, and that's the whole conflict here. You talked about the best and kindness of people, and that really does come out. I mean, the public, and we've just seen, people really do care about this issue, and people don't want to see their neighbours or people in their community go hungry, and that's human nature. But at the same time, we shouldn't have to support people through food banks. That just shouldn't have to exist. So it's such a conflict. So these positives are positives when I'm looking for some, but the whole fact that we're talking about food banks mean that it's not necessarily a positive anyway. Like I said, the public really rallied behind us, supported us. We had people wanting to volunteer. People did want to help. We had people who were furloughed, and they wanted to be useful. And that just shows that the public are, there is a whole lot of kindness out there. And people are going hungry, but that kindness kept us going and kept us supporting those people throughout this crisis. And we don't know what's ahead. And I would encourage people to continue, if they can, to support their local food bank through donations. The food banks worked really hard, and I'm here talking on behalf of 22 of them. I feel like a fraud because they're the heroes. They're the guys on the ground. I mean, I was sitting working from home behind a computer, contacting them regularly to make sure they're okay and trying to do what we could. But these are the guys that were on the ground working crazy hours. I mean, some of them, I've had to tell them to take a break. They have been working so hard, and I think that they're the heroes. And I can't emphasize how much how appreciative we are of those people, the staff and the volunteers. Another positive is we were able to set up a partnership with Advice NI. Now, the Trussell Trust, we're clear that we are trying to address the root causes of people need food bank, and in many cases that's the benefit system. Now, whether that's people not getting the benefits that they are entitled to, or whether or not they need an independent body such as Advice NI or Community Advice or the Advice NI members to challenge a decision that's been made. And I have family members who have a family member who's very disabled, and without giving too much details because she'll kill me, but very disabled, and she's been told she's not eligible for PIP. And I mean, organisations like Advice NI are essential. So being able to have a partnership with this organisation has been an ambition that I wanted from the day I started the Trussell Trust, and it's great to have that. And what that means is, if anyone calls Advice NI, they will assess that person's need. They will see if they need a benefit entitlement check, if they have any issues with debts, if they need to appeal a decision. But they'll also then, if that person is struggling and needs an emergency food, they can make a referral online to our food banks. And that's amazing. That takes away the need for paper, the need for a lot of kind of face-to-face contact that we would have relied on beforehand. So we're still trying to reach those people as they're in crisis. Another bit of that partnership is that my food banks can now refer people online to Advice NI. So when we're with a client, and whether we're phoning them up or delivering food, our volunteers and staff are trained now to ask that client, look, we can get you a bit more support to address some of the issues that you might be facing. All I need is permission to give your name and your phone number to Advice NI. We do that online via a secure platform. GDPR has been thought about, don't worry. And what happens is Advice NI will attempt to call that person 3 times. So there's nothing needed on their half, their part. They don't need to do anything else. Advice NI will make the call and try and help that person address some of the issues. And hopefully that means that they won't need to come back to our food bank. So yeah, there's not many positives. Those are the positives. Some of the challenges, I mean, I could go on for weeks and I won't, and I could bring you all down and I won't. The biggest challenge really is the benefit system. And as it stands, it's not working. And in Northern Ireland, look, we have things that we kill for in England. We've got mitigations and they're very welcome. We have our discretionary support scheme is over and above what they've got in certain areas of England where they have local welfare assistance schemes. We have got good things in place and we have some changes to universal credit. And let's give credit where credit's due. The executive did fight for a lot of those and did get a lot of those. And we welcome the minister's commitment to extending and strengthening those mitigations. And Trussell are part of the Cliff Edge Coalition that are campaigning for that. So, I mean, look, there are positives and we have to give credit to our elected representatives, as tough as it feels to do that today. But, give them credit where credit's due, and that's important. But we need the benefit system to be improved further. And we've been campaigning to end the 5-week wait for universal credit. That's essential. I mean, if I lost my job, I would have to wait 5 weeks to get money, and advances aren't the answer. That's just lending money to people and then reducing. It's not the solution. And look, we've been asking for this before COVID. This is something that we've been talking about way before this. I stood in January in Fermanagh and Omagh District Council, and I was telling the same thing. We need to change the benefit system. All COVID has done is just shine a light on how ineffective the current system is. We don't need to scrap universal credit. We need to fix universal credit. We don't need to, overhaul the whole system. We just need to fix it. And the government need to sit and listen to us and fund that. And the shocking headline figure that Trussell Trust are saying is that this winter our food banks are expecting to give out emergency food parcels every 9 seconds across the UK. That in itself is an absolute shame. I mean, it just shows a failure on the current system and it needs to be fixed. So another challenge has been the flurry of activity in response to the pandemic. And look, our food banks were overwhelmed with calls for support and volunteer, and that's been people wanting to help, and that shows that people do want to help and do want to address this problem. But also, the DFC in some cases weren't exactly helpful. And I have to be careful maybe how I say this, but the food box scheme is one that I would want to highlight in particular. And this is based on feedback from my food banks, that flooding the system with food has just caused more problems than solutions. And how we were consulted about this initiative is also something that I would like to kind of highlight. I found out about the food box initiative on Sunday, the 5th of April, via an article in Belfast Live. And I suppose, given the fact that Trussell Trust have been in Northern Ireland for a number of years, represent 22 food banks, we also speak to the likes of Louise and Storehouse and other independent food banks, and we try to work together and coordinate what we do. And we know what we're doing. I mean, we're the guys that have been on the ground doing this for years. And I feel that we were slightly let down by the DFC in that they didn't consult with myself, my food banks, or other independent food banks about how they would go about this initiative. It was something that was done onto communities as opposed to in consultation with communities. And the day after it launched, I spent a week working with my food bank managers to reassure them that it's okay to say no. You do not have to take part in this initiative. The rules around it were unclear, and I feel it wasn't well thought out. It was primarily to protect people who are shielding, which is coming from a good place, and I have to give credit. Look, I don't believe there was any malice. I don't believe that there was anything wrong with trying to do what they did. But ultimately, the stats show that over 3/4 of those food boxes went to people who were in poverty. There was a massive amount of duplication in the system. And we found that those food boxes in many cases were donated back to our food banks because they were given to people who weren't asking for them. I have cases where we had people dumping them in public, and we had people who just received food boxes who never asked in the first place about them. So it just was something that it could have been so much better if there was consultation. But my view as well would be that let us deal with addressing the symptoms of poverty, and if the government could focus on addressing the causes. And that's really where I'm at in terms of my position. Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about the challenges. I don't want to go really negative, but the big problem here in Northern Ireland is financial hardship. And the answer to the financial hardship is definitely not food. The government need to stop the flow of people needing food banks rather than increasing the levels of support for food banks. And my colleague Ollie will talk more strategically about Trust as a whole, but the government's commitment to give money to food banks, the Trust are not going to accept that money. We believe that the government should be funding measures to address those causes as opposed to the symptoms. And I use the analogy, I came from housing back in the day. You don't solve homelessness by putting people up in a hotel for the night. And similarly, you don't solve poverty by giving someone a week's worth of food. So, we really do need, something to change in that system. So what am I kind of saying now is our elected representatives and policymakers need to stop treating food poverty as a standalone issue. It's not. The issue isn't food poverty. It's not fuel poverty. It's not period poverty. It's not, any of those issues that you kind of divide up. It's all poverty. And we need to tackle that head on. And we need to tackle that in a joint up approach. We need to stop thinking about giving food to those who are struggling as the solution. It's not the solution. All this does is address the symptoms. If the DFC can set up a food box scheme quickly, or if the Department for Education can set up payments in lieu of free school meals, which is brilliant. The free school meal payment, I have to give credit where credit's due. Fantastic. That was a really positive initiative. If that can be done overnight, we can do more to stop the causes of people needing food banks overnight. And we need to do that and put that at front and center of our approach. Our discretionary support scheme is on paper good. It's cash only. I mean, we're not offering people anything other than cash. It's a telephone line. There's clear, criteria. Could be clearer, but there are criteria. You can get a grant. You can get loans. That's way and above what other areas of the UK are offering. If we could have used that money to enhance that system and change the culture of the discretionary support team, we could have seen, far less people needing to come to the food bank. So look, we've got the bones of we've got the bare bones of what's needed here in Northern Ireland. We just need to, be focused on addressing causes. At the Trust then, and I don't want to kind of steal Polly's lines, but we are fully committed to ending the need for food banks. We don't want to have to exist. Polly's going to share more about this after, but also our food banks, all 22 of our food banks in Northern Ireland are committed to closing too. Many of them were set up by churches and ran under that registered charity. But sadly, as demand has grown, some of these food banks are now setting up as their own charity because it's just the volume of work needed it just demands it to be registered as its own charity as opposed to running off the church. And in many cases, they're setting up not as a food bank, but as a wider charity. And that shows they're committed to thinking beyond the food bank. They want to be able to offer services such as counselling, such as helping people make their money go further, whether that's cooking classes, anything that might help address the causes rather than just giving out food. So our food banks in that are showing their commitment to ending the need for food banks. Food bank will be part of their charity as opposed to the only thing in their charity. And I suppose I can ask you one kind of thing as well you can do. We've published our mid-year stats today. And on the back of this, we have a new campaign called Hunger Free Future. If you go to our website, and I'll put the link in the chat, you can join our campaign for Hunger Free Future. So that is everything I have to say. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think you covered all angles and the chat box has been really lively. So I'm really keen to get to some of those questions as well. Just a couple of things I wanted to comment on off the back of yours is, absolutely acknowledge the kindness of people. It has been amazing. And I think our challenge, well, personally, I think our challenge is changing that kindness into political activism. So we need to start to encourage people who are donating to food banks to ask their politicians, ask their local representatives, what are you actually doing to address the root causes of poverty? What are you doing to improve the social security system? You did say that the minister has agreed to extend and strengthen the mitigation package. And I'm a member of the Cliff Edge Coalition as well. And we do agree that that's really positive, but we are distressed that there has been no action. And as you say, look how quickly they were able to set up a food parcel distribution service. Why can't they add that, for example, £6.5 million to either the contingency fund, which provides people with the grant through the 5-week wait, or indeed to the discretionary support fund? I'm seeing real problems with the discretionary support fund. For example, if you take an advance payment in universal credit, that means that that debt is added to your account. So therefore, when you apply for a discretionary support grant or a loan, they take that into consideration, and it really precludes you from getting that financial support. So yeah, I'd really love to work further with you guys on that if there's an opportunity. But thank you very much. I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to swiftly pass over to Polly because I really want to get to some of these questions and comments in the chat box. Over to you, Polly.
Thanks, Kyra. Morning, everybody, and morning especially to some of our food banks that I can see represented on the call. I think, Kyra, you gave us all about 10 minutes. I'm going to cut mine a bit shorter because I think it's really important we have some time for discussion. So let's cut straight to the core of the issues. You know, when the Trussell Trust started setting up food banks 10 years ago, it was done out of a I think lots of the reasons that Louise outlined, people really trying to act with compassion in their local communities and support people who they were worried about who not having enough food. But every person who's spoken this morning has made it clear that the question we need to be asking ourselves is this the right way, the best way to support people? Is charity the right way to do it? Where is the justice in all of this? What should we be doing? And we can see very clearly from the information the Trussell Trust has been gathering through its food bank network across all parts of the country, that the main reasons that people come to food banks is because they haven't got enough money. Maybe that's because of benefit delays or problems with the benefits. But the reason people give is that they haven't got enough money. It's not that they haven't got enough food. It's absolutely categorically clear it's about money. When we've asked people about their experiences and what life has been like in the period leading up to them coming to a food bank, 9 out of 10 people would be classed as being destitute. I mean, that's not a little bit poor. That is absolutely skint. You haven't probably been able to afford more than a couple of meals over the last days. You might not have had heating on in your house. You haven't been able to buy essential items of clothing for you or your kids. It's a really serious level of existence, or with very few resources. And for many people in that circumstance, maybe they've had just £50 to live on for a week. It's not enough money. We also know that people who are visiting our food banks are coming with lots of complex issues, lots of people with living with serious health issues, or for themselves or people in their family, and also complex mental health issues for themselves or somebody in their family. So when we think about putting into practice concrete steps that would help us achieve our vision of a Northern Ireland, a Scotland, a Wales and England without food banks, and think about those practical steps, they're the very fundamental issues we're looking at needing to address. You know, if a food bank shut its doors, how are those people going to get the support they need to be able to buy the things that they need and address and operate with all of these complex things going on in their lives? So it's absolutely clear that food is not going to be the answer to that. It's part of it, and food in lots of other ways is such a great bringer together of communities, something we enjoy sharing with our family and friends, which is why the lockdown restrictions have been so painful for lots of people. But food doesn't address issues of destitution. Food doesn't address issues of mental health or of disability. So today, alongside releasing Trussell's new data on how many more food parcels we've given out over the last period, which is 80% more in Northern Ireland, 80% more in the last 6 months than in the 6 months last year. We're launching a new strategy. We've been doing a huge amount of thinking about what our role is in the kind of growth of food aid and what is the right thing for us to be doing right now. And we've taken a lot of advice from our food banks, from people who visit food banks, from people who don't visit our food banks because it's the last place they'd want to go, even if they can't put food on their table. And, you know, we've decided that absolutely we need to be the biggest drivers for change in dismantling this food aid structure that we're a part of. And it's not a straightforward, simple solution, because, as I said, we've got to put in place a lot of support to be able to withdraw, to be able to say that actually we don't need our doors open, because we're confident that people are getting the things that they need from other places. So there's 3 things that we want to do. The first is really looking at the policy landscape, because fundamentally, when we created our social security system, our welfare system, it was about putting in place a safety net so that if anybody was in need, there was something that would catch you, that you didn't fall through those gaps and end up at risk of being destitute and looking for someone else to help you with charity to feed yourself and your family. So fundamentally, there needs to be a huge amount of policy change. And actually, it's not just social security, it's also about the world of work, because our employment situation has massively changed. There's been a rise in insecure, low-paid contracts, and many of the people that we see coming to food banks, that's their kind of employment support, and it's not providing the stability and the security that it should do. So we need to be looking across the board at social security and at the world of work. And some of our calls at the moment are about asking the Westminster government to lock in the £20 it's added onto universal credit. But that's just a small step. I mean, it comes to something when we're asking for something like that from the Westminster government, knowing a small step, but knowing how hard it will be to secure that. But that's our starting point at the moment with Westminster, but we want to see a proper social security safety net that catches everybody and provides what they need. But on a local level, there's some really important questions about how local services and organisations can support people before they come to a food bank. Because, and many of you might work and be engaged in organisations that do just this in Northern Ireland or in other places, if you've joined us from somewhere else with the magic of technology. But I guess that's a question for all of you, is if you work for another organisation or a support organisation that can provide support to somebody so that they might not need to come to a food bank, maybe you can help someone get all the benefits they're entitled to. Maybe you can help somebody address a root cause of why they might come, the debt that they're experiencing or other kind of personal circumstances. Then there's something in this for you. How can you help us make sure that we've got in place all the support in our society so that there's never any question of anybody needing to come to a food bank? So there's national policy change and there's local community change about the support networks that we can put in place and we can build so that you don't need to come to a food bank in the first place. I think I will leave it there. I'd love to tell you a bit more about some of our work and the practical experience where we've tested this out in Scotland, but maybe I'll get a chance to share some of that in questions, because we want to hear from all of you. So as Paul mentioned, if you're feeling angry about this, if you think that food aid should not be part of what you're doing, if you're committed to doing something in the long term, please support our Hunger Free Future campaign. The link is in the chat box. If you want to communicate with your elected representatives about what more they can do, send them an email, write to them, go for a walk. I hear that's popular these days. Go for a walk and tell them about the policy change they need to put in place as well. And look forward to hearing some of your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Polly. That was really impassioned, and I'm with you all the way. One important stat, another important stat that come out this week is that 25% of people in Northern Ireland are earning below the living wage. We have, that's the highest percentage in all of the UK. So we're really, really failing on that point as well. So, you know, as well as there being an increase of people in destitution, those that are out of work and disabled who are in poverty, but also that those that are in work because they're just genuinely not getting paid enough in their jobs, enable for them to reach a minimum standard of living, let alone a decent standard of living. Okay, I'm just going to go over to the chat box. Thank you so much. There's a lot of consensus around the social security system and the fact that it just isn't working, particularly the 5-week wait. Tony, thanks so much for all of your contributions in relation to that. A really good question from Philippa, more warmly known to me as Pip, friend, who has asked that I know we're focusing on food banks and the pandemic, but what do panelists think about the likely impact of the end of the Brexit transition period in January 2021? Louise, Paul, Polly, do we think that this is going to add another concerning aspect to the need for food aid? I'll go to you, Polly.
Yeah, I was just looking at everyone's faces, wondering if it was going to be me. I think you will have some specific experiences from Northern Ireland that are obviously affected differently because of what happens with the particular fallout of the trade deal and border issues. But it certainly looks like there's a concern, although some particular products might be harder to reach over the Brexit period, they're not ones that are going to affect most people, and there'll be other choices. The biggest concern is about the potentially incremental rises of the cost of basic foodstuffs, and how that will affect the people that we meet. So, I mean, there's been a longer term sort of trend, and it's mapped very closely what's happening with food prices, but that's our biggest concern.
Thank you. And Paul, do you have anything to add to that question?
Nope, that's Polly's hit me on the head there.
Thank you very much. And if anybody else has anything to say, particularly, or any expertise, particularly around Brexit, just raise your hand and I'll be able to come to you as well. Another question that Claire Kemp has brought up is, she is saying that Claire Kemp from the Children's Law Centre said that she is on the co-design group for the Anti-Poverty Strategy, which is currently being developed at the minute. And she wondered what the panel asks would be in terms of an anti-poverty strategy for Northern Ireland. Louise, I'll come to you on that. If you were to ask, what would your ask be in terms of the anti-poverty strategy?
Yeah, I suppose it is this change in narrative, isn't it? I think we need to build community, not break it down, and build this sense of that communities work better when they, look after one another, and that there's that reciprocal opportunity for people to be involved in communities and to give back. So in our food bank, people who have used the food bank in the past come back and volunteer with us, and it's just an opportunity. So it's that changing that narrative, because I think until we get that, the rest of it is just fluff. That's a core change in how we view those who are struggling or in need at any given time.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the chat box, and I'm actually going to invite Israel to speak. Israel, if you don't mind, you have found it really challenging across the period of the pandemic to get culturally appropriate food for people that you support. Do you want to say a wee bit more about that, Israel?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone will understand my English. My tone is a little bit awkward, but please bear with me. I'm not from here. Before ISA started 5 years ago, majorly we provide befriending service. We befriend people at home, take people out for a cup of coffee, coffee buddy, call it anything, we just befriend. But during the COVID-19, we found out that a lot of people were struggling, and people we befriended, or we were befriending then, when we got to their kitchen, we saw this pile of black beans. You know, they were building skyscraper of black beans. And I asked one of the Somalian woman, why are you not eating it? She said, I don't know what it is. Never seen it, never eaten it. So then why don't we take it back? So we took those food, we brought them back to one of the local food banks. Then I went back there 2 weeks later, and she said her son was starving. So, but there's food in the house. She said, no, we don't know how to use it. But they were asylum seekers. She suffers sort of mental health issues. So she said they only receive £35 a week, and she can't go out to even buy the food from where they normally source the food from, because it was lockdown period. So we went out, we donated money among us on our team, and then we got them some halal food, and we made lunch with them, and they ate and they were happy. So we started looking for food banks that provide such food, culturally appropriate food. We didn't find any, so I went to East Belfast Mission, and then they gave me a food pack again. It was the same food. So the number started growing, because the woman called another Somalian woman and said, well, these people came and they made food for my family. And then the phone started ringing. The phone was ringing nonstop. Can you help us? Can you help us? So we didn't know what to do. We haven't applied for grant before. So I did a survey on culturally appropriate food, and 250 people returned that survey. So I emailed it to someone in CF, working in CFNI, and said, look, there is a need for this. What do we do? And she advised that we apply for grant and we can provide that. So I passed on the same survey to the Nigerian community Northern Ireland, NICONI. I'm also a member of that community, and also other organizations, that they could actually apply for grants to source out culturally appropriate food. So we got some grant, and then 80 packs of the food packs were delivered, food parcels were delivered, but the telephones never stopped ringing. But we didn't want it to be a thing of reputation. So we started advising them, how much do you have? We can go shopping for you. If you can't leave the house, let's do the shopping for you. You know, so they would say, we'll have 15 pounds, we'll match it up with 10 pounds, you know, stuff like that, so that they don't depend on the food parcels, because a lot of people started calling them later, oh, we need food next week. So gradually it started building up, and we found that there's no long-term solution here. Then another category of people were people who were followed or relieved of their jobs. They have that 5 weeks gap where they had nothing, absolutely nothing. So that was another great challenge, and they won't speak out because most people don't want to go to the food bank because of the stigma. Even when we advise, there are some who have lived here for so many years. I've been in Europe for over 28 years, lived in Germany and lived here as well. So I'm used to the food. There are people like me who are used to the food. So if I advise them, why don't you go to the food bank? They will say, no, it's for poor people. But you are poor, you don't have money, you know? So they don't want to be seen as poor. And then we start borrowing money and being in debt. Two families can't get out of the debt. They borrowed about 3,000 throughout the lockdown to feed themselves. They can't pay it back, you know? So those are some of the challenges that we face. But thankfully, we were able to solve some of them because of the grants we were able to secure. And I'm very grateful that some people here said they can provide halal food, so we can then signpost some of our service users, you know, and this has impacted on most of their mental health, to be honest, you know, so that's just some of the challenges.
Thank you so much, Israel, and I'm really glad to see in the chat box that you've been able to make connections with some of the other food banks that are providing culturally appropriate foods. But I think you hit another issue as well, and that is the fact that how can asylum seekers be expected to live on £37.75 per week? And, you know, it's just ludicrous. And, you know, again, considering the benefit system, it's the exact same problem with refugees and asylum seekers that we're welcoming into our country. They're faced with this hostile environment, and they're going through a difficult enough time as it is without facing the added stigma and shame that many associate with going to the food bank and then maybe getting food that is not suitable for their needs or for their beliefs. I have to say that I had a personal experience where I referred somebody for a food parcel just a couple of days ago, and they rang back and said that they couldn't avail of most of it because they were lactose intolerant. You know, so I really learned a lesson from that in terms of making sure that you try to ask people, you know, have they got any specific needs that they need addressed? And really, I turned around and ended up giving that particular person cash, and you know, and I was able to do that, thankfully, in my own local St. Vincent de Paul. But the problem is that because we're not getting the donations in, or through cash donations through the charity boxes after mass services, after church services, you know, we're relying more heavily on food banks as well, and we're not able to give out cash as readily because we just don't have it there. So it really is a vicious circle. And I read a piece in an article a couple of days ago that says, you know, once the food bank gets out of the bottle, it's like a genie in a bottle. Once it pops out, it's really, really hard to get it back in again. So, you know, I'm really behind Trussell Trust's efforts to try and make sure that they do put that unfortunate genie in the bottle. I'm just looking at some other, there was another question that came from a colleague, Siobhan, who asked whether the recent breakdowns provide any indication of the profile of people who are attending the food bank. Is it mostly, for example, lone parents? Is it women? Is it, you know, single men? Like, what is that profile of people? Do you have any kind of comments to make on that, Paul or Polly?
Oh, you go.
Right, I was going to say I probably wanted to talk while I quickly look on my dashboard and bring up the details. But yeah, so when someone's referred to our food bank, they will capture, that's part of the referral process, is to capture key information on who is coming to the food bank. I'm not very good at talking and doing stuff at the same time, so I can't talk and look up our stats at the same time, the dashboard, to get that. But yeah, we do have a breakdown of the primary reasons someone was referred to the food bank. Now, those top 3 reasons are generally, you know, benefit delays, change in benefits, and low income. I mean, that's why our focus in Trussell is very, very, very much on addressing some of the issues with the social security system. In terms of the breakdown of people, yes, we have household size and you know, families or children. That's how I was able to tell you about the number of parcels that went to children, for example, and then the number of parcels that went overall. So yes, because I'm talking, I can't actually use the dashboard at the same time.
Ollie, post that link, Paul, into the chat box then.
I've put the link in already. It's a state, so have a look at our State of Hunger report. It's a really long, weird link. I don't know why it's so weird with lots of funny symbols, but just press the link and it'll tell you a breakdown which answers all of those questions that you were just asking.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. We could talk all day, but we have committed to limiting this event to 1 hour. If anybody has any follow-up questions that they would like to put to any members of the panel, I'm really happy to field those questions. And if the panel are happy to maybe take individual questions, if anybody has them, I will forward them on and get back to you with the response. So yeah, I just want to say a massive thank you to Louise, to Paul, to Polly. I think that we can be really united in this and get behind that campaign to rid the UK of food banks. We can do it, and we just need to start talking openly about it and engaging more consistently and persistently with our politicians to say that this is not the kind of society that we want to live in. So thank you very much, everybody, and I want you to well, and please join our next COVID conversation if you can. All the best.